Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Marcus laughed as he tipped his crystal flute, watching the vintage Cabernet bloom like a bloodstain across Elena's white silk dress in front of the entire board. The liquid was ice cold, a sharp shock against her skin that made her breath hitch, but she didn't move. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there as the dark red wine traveled down the expensive fabric, dripping onto the mahogany floor of the Vance Manor boardroom. "Oops," Marcus said, his voice dripping with a practiced, aristocratic charm that had fooled everyone in this room for years. He didn't offer a napkin. Instead, he flashed a brilliant, predatory smile at the gathered directors. "I suppose I forgot you were standing there, Elena. Then again, you've always been so easy to overlook." A few of the younger board members chuckled, the sound thin and sycophantic. Elena looked around the table. Beatrice Vance sat at the far end, her expression unreadable, her fingers tracing the edge of a gold-rimmed saucer. She didn't scold her son for the accident. She didn't even look Elena in the eye. Nearby, Arthur Vance sat in his high-backed chair, his face pale and drawn from his recent illness, his eyes narrowed as he watched the scene play out. He looked like a man watching a play he'd seen too many times before. Elena felt the heavy scent of the fermented grapes rising from her chest, cloying and sweet, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of the room's tension. She could feel the damp silk clinging to her ribs, a cold reminder of her standing in this family. To them, she was the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who stayed late to fix the ledgers while Marcus spent the company's capital at the high-stakes tables in Macau. "You should probably go change," Marcus continued, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive peppermint on his breath. He lowered his voice, though not enough to hide his words from the witnesses. "Actually, don't bother coming back. We were just about to discuss the new restructuring plan. It's a bit high-level for a glorified bookkeeper, don't you think?" "The audit is still in progress, Marcus," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. It was the first time she had spoken since the wine hit her. He laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "The audit is whatever I say it is. Mother and I have already decided. Your department is being absorbed. You're redundant, Elena. It's time you realized that being a Vance by name doesn't make you a Vance by nature." He turned his back on her then, dismissing her as if she were a piece of furniture. He began to gesture toward the large projector screen at the front of the room, his movements grand and theatrical. Elena stood her ground for 5 seconds longer than she should have, letting the humiliation settle, letting the board members see the wronged daughter-in-law in her ruined finery. She caught Arthur's gaze. For a fleeting second, the old man's eyes sparked with something, not pity but a grim curiosity. He knew what Marcus didn't. He knew that Elena didn't just keep the books, she memorized them. Elena turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. The sharp click of her heels on the marble foyer outside was the only sound in the sudden silence of her departure. She didn't go to her room to cry. She didn't call a friend to complain. Instead, she walked straight to her small, cramped office at the back of the estate. Once inside, she locked the door. Her hands were trembling now, but not from sadness. It was the adrenaline of a hunter who had finally seen the prey step into the light. She reached into the hidden pocket of her damp blazer and pulled out her smartphone. She had pressed record the moment she entered the boardroom. Marcus's voice, clear and arrogant, played back to her. "The audit is whatever I say it is." She set the phone on the desk and opened her laptop. A notification was already waiting for her. It was an encrypted file from Julian Thorne, the firm's lead investigator. "Found the offshore accounts, the message read. It's worse than we thought. He didn't just lose the money, Elena. He collateralized the family estate." Elena leaned back, the wet silk of her dress a cold weight against her skin. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a simple silver signet ring, a gift from Arthur Vance years ago, given to her in secret. "For the one who actually watches the gates," he had whispered. She slipped the ring onto her finger. Marcus thought he had just humiliated a bookkeeper. He thought he had cleared the path for his final takeover. He didn't realize that by ruining her dress, he had finally stripped away her last shred of loyalty to the Vance name. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Sarah Miller, the head of the family's legal team. The board meeting for the final vote is in 48 hours. Are you sure you want to do this? Elena looked at the red stain on her chest, then back at the screen. Her fingers flew across the keys. He wants a restructuring, she typed. Let's give him one. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the lights of the manor reflect in the dark pond outside. Marcus was probably still toasting his victory, unaware that the lion he had been poking for years had finally stopped sleeping. The countdown had begun. She had 48 hours to turn his oops into the most expensive mistake of his life. Elena didn't need a new dress. She needed a witness, and she knew exactly where to find one. The next morning, the heavy scent of beeswax and cold lilies hung in the air of the Vance manor, a suffocating reminder of the family's obsession with appearances. Elena Vance stood in the sun-drenched breakfast room, her fingers curled tightly around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. She had traded her ruined silk for a sharp, charcoal gray blazer, a suit that felt more like armor than attire. The rhythmic, hollow thud-thud of a cane echoed against the marble floors of the hallway. Arthur Vance entered the room, his face a map of weary lines, his eyes tracking his daughter with a piercing clarity that belied his frail frame. He didn't speak, but the brief, firm nod he gave her felt like a silent passing of a torch. He knew the rot that was eating their legacy, even if he was too weak to cut it out himself. "You're up early," a sharp voice cut through the quiet. Beatrice Vance swept into the room, draped in silk that cost more than a year of Silas's salary. She didn't look at Elena's face. Instead, her eyes drifted to the spot where the wine had ruined the dress the night before. "I hope you've sent an apology to Marcus. Your emotional outburst was quite embarrassing for the guests." The injustice of the statement tasted like copper in Elena's mouth. "He poured a glass of Cabernet down my front, Mother." "I believe the apology is owed to me," Beatrice scoffed, reaching for a silver cream pitcher. "He's under a lot of pressure with the restructuring. You've always been so sensitive, Elena. It's that lack of resilience that makes your father hesitate to give you more responsibility." Before Elena could respond, the double doors swung open. Marcus Vance marched in, the embodiment of unearned confidence. He was already dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, his hair slicked back to perfection. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he pulled a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket and flicked it onto the table in front of Elena. It fluttered like a dying bird before landing in a puddle of spilled cream. "For the dry cleaning," Marcus said, his voice dripping with casual malice. Though, honestly, that rag wasn't worth the chemical wash. Consider it a tip for staying out of my way today. Beatrice chuckled softly, a sound that felt like a betrayal. Elena felt the familiar heat of rage rising, but she forced it down, channeling it into the cold, hard space in her chest where her plan was taking shape. She didn't touch the money. She didn't even blink. "The board meeting is in 47 hours, Marcus," she said, her voice level and terrifyingly calm. "I suggest you spend that time practicing your presentation. You'll want to be very clear about where the offshore capital is coming from." Marcus froze, his hand hovering over a piece of toast. The smug curve of his lip faltered for a fraction of a second before his mask of arrogance snapped back into place. "I don't know what fairy tales you're whispering to yourself, but I have the votes. By Thursday afternoon, you'll be lucky if I let you keep your office in the basement." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were a piece of furniture. Elena watched him for a moment, then turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her heels clicking like a countdown against the stone. She headed toward the back of the estate, where the manicured lawns gave way to the rugged, honest earth of the stables. Silas was there, the smell of hay and old leather clinging to his worn coat. He was the only one who had stayed loyal to the land rather than the name. "Is it ready?" she asked. Silas reached into a rusted tool cabinet and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Its edges were frayed, the paper yellowed with age. "Your grandfather kept 2 sets of books, Miss Elena, one for the taxman and one for the truth. Marcus thinks he's found the secrets in the digital files, but he doesn't realize the real bones are buried in ink." Elena took the book, the weight of it grounding her. She felt a surge of secret power. Marcus was playing a game of checkers on a board he didn't realize she had already flipped. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a secure message from Sarah Miller. "The forensic audit is complete. We found the ghost accounts. Marcus hasn't just been gambling with his own money, he's been using the Vance pension fund as collateral." Elena looked toward the main house, where Marcus was likely still laughing with Beatrice. He thought he was the wolf at the door, but he had forgotten that she was the one who held the keys. 46 hours, she whispered to the empty air. She opened the ledger to the final page, where her grandfather's sprawling script detailed a debt that Marcus could never repay, a debt that would strip him of his name, his status, and the very roof over his head. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital recorder, clicking it shut as she prepared for her next meeting. The lion wasn't just awake, it was hunting, and the first trap was already set. 2 days later, the morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian Thorne's downtown office, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching as the veteran attorney turned the final page of the forensic report Sarah Miller had delivered at midnight. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock and the distant hum of city traffic 30 floors below. Julian finally looked up, his expression uncharacteristically grim. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of his computer screen. "It's not just embezzlement, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Marcus didn't just move money. He forged your grandfather's signature on the pension fund collateral documents. If these loans default, and based on his gambling debts, they will, the entire Vance estate, including the staff's retirement accounts, will be liquidated to cover his margins." Elena felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine, but she didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and touched the smooth, cold casing of the digital recorder. It was the secret power she carried, a weight that felt heavier than the ledger itself. "He thinks he's untouchable because Beatrice supports him," she said quietly. "He thinks the Vance name is a shield." "He's mistaken," Julian replied, sliding a heavy, silver-sealed envelope across the desk. "This is the temporary injunction. It won't stop him from attending the gala tomorrow night, but it ensures that the moment he tries to announce his chairmanship, he's legally walking into a trap. We have the ghost accounts tied directly to his personal offshore holdings. He's built a kingdom on air, Elena." She took the envelope, the thick parchment crinkling under her touch. The scent of fresh ink and old law books anchored her. "Tomorrow night," she whispered. 24 hours. When she arrived back at the Vance estate an hour later, the air was thick with the smell of expensive lilies and floor wax. The foyer was a hive of activity as caterers and decorators prepared for the legacy gala. At the center of the chaos stood Marcus, looking every bit the conquering hero in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than Silas's annual salary. He was currently berating Silas near the grand staircase. The elderly groundskeeper held a tray of crystal glassware, his hands trembling slightly. "I told you no smudges," Marcus snapped, his voice carrying easily over the bustle of the workers. He didn't just speak, he projected his entitlement like a weapon. "If you can't handle a simple task like polishing lead crystal, perhaps you've outlived your usefulness to this family. My father might have tolerated your incompetence out of some misplaced sense of loyalty, but I have no such sentimental weaknesses." Beatrice stood nearby, adjusting a floral arrangement. She didn't look up, her silence acting as a silent endorsement of her son's cruelty. "Marcus, dear, don't stress yourself," she murmured. "The help just needs a firm hand." Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The sound cut through Marcus's tirade. "The glassware is fine, Silas," she said, her voice calm and level. "Why don't you take a break in the kitchen? I'll handle things here." Marcus turned, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. He checked his reflection in a nearby gilded mirror, adjusting his silk tie with a casual, maddening confidence. Ah, the family accountant returns. Still clutching that dusty ledger, I see. You look tired, Elena. All those numbers must be taxing your limited imagination. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the scent of expensive scotch and heavy cologne preceding him. You should be thanking me, he whispered, loud enough for the nearby decorators to hear. While you've been playing with your little spreadsheets, I've secured the future of this legacy. Tomorrow night, I'm announcing a merger that will make the Vance name global. You'll be surplus to requirements then. I might keep you on as a clerk out of pity, but don't expect a seat at the main table. Elena met his gaze, refusing to blink. She felt the weight of the injunction in her bag, a hidden blade ready to strike. A merger built on what, Marcus? You should be careful about what you promise the board. Legacies built on lies have a habit of collapsing. Marcus laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that grated against the elegance of the room. Lies. I'm the one with the vision. You're just the girl who stays in the shadows, counting the coins I earn. You don't belong in this world, and by Monday, you won't even have a key to the front door. He turned back to the room, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Make sure the champagne is chilled to exactly 44 degrees, he shouted to a passing server. We're celebrating a new era. Elena watched him walk away, his arrogance so thick it was almost tangible. He had no idea that the very floor he stood on was already shifting. She looked up toward the second-floor balcony, where Arthur Vance sat in his wheelchair, watching the scene with unreadable eyes. She touched her purse one last time, feeling the digital recorder. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. Marcus was at the peak of his perceived power, oblivious to the fact that he had already signed his own professional death warrant. 20 hours, she murmured to herself, the sound lost in the noise of the preparations. The lion wasn't just hunting anymore, it was closing in for the kill. Tomorrow, the forged legacy would burn, and Marcus would finally learn the true cost of the Vance name. The following morning, the Vance Crest estate felt like a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Elena Vance sat in the library, the scent of aged leather and beeswax grounding her as she watched the gardeners through the tall windows. They were busy manicuring the hedges for tomorrow's gala, oblivious to the fact that the man paying their wages was currently bleeding the family dry. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Marcus Vance stepped inside. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous ambition. He didn't look at the shelves of books that had belonged to their grandfather. He only looked at the mahogany desk as if it were a throne he had already won. Still hiding in the shadows with your ledgers, I see, he said, his voice carrying that familiar, jagged edge of condescension. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of a glass-fronted cabinet, a smirk tugging at his lips. You should really try to enjoy the sunlight, Elena. By this time tomorrow, I'll be making the decisions on who stays on this property and who is escorted to the gate. She didn't look up from her tablet, though her pulse thrummed against her ribs. She was looking at a series of wire transfers, money Marcus thought he had hidden behind layers of shell companies. A legacy built on a forged foundation doesn't usually survive the first storm, Marcus. Are you sure you've accounted for every variable? He let out a sharp, barking laugh and walked toward her, invading her personal space. He leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across her hands. Variables? I've secured the board, I've handled Beatrice, and Arthur is too weak to even hold a pen. You've always been small-minded, stuck in the decimals while I'm looking at the horizon. You're an accountant, not a visionary. Stick to the math and stay out of the way of men who actually know how to lead. He reached out and tapped the screen of her tablet, his designer watch catching the morning light. Don't bother dressing up too much for the signing tomorrow. You wouldn't want to look like you're trying too hard to belong in a room that's already closed to you. He turned on his heel and marched out, the sound of his Italian leather shoes echoing like a countdown against the marble floor. Elena waited until the door clicked shut before she let out a slow, measured breath. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool, smooth plastic of the secondary drive. Marcus was so blinded by the glare of his own perceived brilliance that he couldn't see the shadow she had cast over his entire operation. An hour later, she found Sela's in the greenhouse. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The old man was pruning the orchids with a steady hand, his eyes sharp despite his age. "The staff is talking, Miss Elena," Silas murmured, not looking up from his work. "They see the trucks arriving. They see the crates of vintage wine. Marcus is telling everyone the new era begins at noon tomorrow." "Let him talk, Silas," she replied softly. "The louder he is now, the quieter the room will be when the truth comes out. Is Arthur ready?" Silas paused, his shears hovering over a stem. "Your father is stronger than he looks. He spent the morning with Julian Thorne. They've reviewed the original trust. Marcus thinks he's playing a game of chess, but he doesn't realize he's playing on a board that was retired 30 years ago." "Good." Elena looked toward the main house, where Beatrice Vance was likely coordinating the floral arrangements with Sarah Miller. The factions were set. On one side stood Marcus and his bought-and-paid-for consultants, fueled by greed and the desperate need for status. On the other stood the quiet loyalty of the people who actually loved the land. "He thinks I'm a decimal point," Elena said, a cold smile finally touching her face. "He thinks I'm just a minor error he can erase from the books." "He always did have trouble with the fine print," Silas agreed, finally meeting her gaze. As the sun began to dip behind the rolling hills of the estate, Elena returned to her room. She spent the evening in a state of clinical preparation, verifying every timestamp and every recorded conversation. The trap wasn't just set, it was locked. She stood on her balcony, looking down at the terrace where the catering crews were setting up the long, white-clothed tables for tomorrow's execution of her family's dignity. She could see Marcus down there, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, gesturing grandly as he spoke to a group of investors. He looked triumphant. He looked like a king. Elena leaned against the railing, the night air chilling her skin. She had given him a dozen chances to be honest, a dozen paths to redemption, and he had trampled over every single one of them with a smirk. Tomorrow, the gala wouldn't be a celebration of a new era. It would be a funeral for a reputation. She checked her watch. 14 hours. The lion had finished the hunt. Now it was just waiting for the sun to rise so it could show the world the kill. The evening arrived with a deceptive softness, the sunset painting the Vance estate in shades of bruised purple and gold. By 7 o'clock, the air was thick with the scent of Casablanca lilies and the expensive, cloying perfumes of 500 invited guests. A string quartet played on the terrace, their music struggling to rise above the polite roar of the city's elite. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers grazing the cool, satin fabric of her clutch. Inside, the weight of a single silver flash drive felt heavier than a lead bar. She had traded her usual sensible wool for a floor-length gown of midnight navy, a color so dark it was almost black. It wasn't a dress for a victim, it was a shroud for an empire. Across the room, Marcus Vance was already holding court. He looked every bit the triumphant heir in a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than the annual property taxes on the estate. He stood in the center of a circle of venture capitalists, a crystal tumbler of amber scotch in his hand. His laughter, loud and jagged, cut through the refined atmosphere like a blade. "It's about vision," he told the group, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "My father had the heart for this land, but he lacked the stomach for the modern market. I've spent the last 6 months trimming the fat. Tomorrow, when the merger is finalized, we won't just be a family business. We'll be a monopoly." Elena watched as Beatrice Vance approached him, her face a mask of fragile pride. She adjusted Marcus's silk bow tie, her diamonds catching the light of the chandeliers. She was the picture of matriarchal grace, oblivious to the fact that the son she was preening had already signed away her mahogany-paneled sanctuary to cover his gambling debts. "There she is," Marcus called out, his eyes locking onto Elena. The circle of investors parted as he beckoned her forward with a dismissive wave of his glass. "The family's little bookkeeper. Come, Elena, don't be shy. Tell Julian Thorne how many spreadsheets you had to color-code to keep up with my expansion plans." Julian Thorne, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was only matched by his net worth, turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning Elena with a clinical curiosity. "I imagine the transition has been complex," Julian said, his voice a low rumble. "Complex is one word for it," Elena replied. She didn't flinch as she stepped into the circle. She felt the eyes of the room on her, the quiet, unstable sister who had been kept in the shadows while the golden boy took the reins. "But I've always found that the numbers eventually tell a very simple story, if you know where to look." Marcus let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. He leaned in, the smell of expensive scotch and arrogance radiating from him. "Always so literal," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That's why you're the help, Elena. You see the trees, but I own the forest. Why don't you go find Sela's and make sure the catering staff isn't stealing the vintage Bordeaux? Leave the business talk to the men who actually have skin in the game." It was a public dismissal, a calculated slap intended to remind everyone in the room of her perceived insignificance. Beatrice looked away, a flicker of discomfort crossing her features before she smoothed it over with a practiced smile. Elena didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, her expression as calm as the surface of a frozen lake. "Of course, Marcus. I'll make sure everything is exactly where it needs to be for your big moment." She turned and walked toward the back of the ballroom, her heels clicking rhythmically against the Italian marble. Each step felt like a countdown. She found Sela's near the service entrance, his weathered face a stark contrast to the Botoxed masks of the guests. The old man's hands were steady as he adjusted a tray of crystal flutes, but his eyes were sharp. "The technicians are in place," Elena asked, her voice barely a breath. Sela's gave a single, slow nod. "Everything is routed through the main server, just as you asked. When he hits the play button for the commemorative video, it won't be the drone footage of the vineyards that comes up on those big screens. And the board members, seated in the front row," Sela's confirmed. "They're expecting a victory lap. They have no idea they're about to watch a confession." Elena felt a surge of cold adrenaline. She looked back at the ballroom. Marcus was now standing on the small raised dais, tapping a microphone. The room began to quiet, the guests turning their attention toward the man they believed was the future of the Vance legacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice booming through the speakers with a charismatic warmth that Elena knew was a lie. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a merger. We celebrate the preservation of a name. My grandfather built this house on a foundation of integrity, and tonight, I am proud to say that I have secured that foundation for the next 100 years. He looked directly at Elena, a smirk playing on his lips, a silent, "I won" that he thought only she could see. He gestured toward the massive LED screens flanking the stage. "Before we head to the dining hall, I want to share a vision of what we've built. Sela's, if you would." The lights in the ballroom began to dim. A hush fell over the crowd as 500 people waited to be impressed. Elena reached into her clutch, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the drive she had swapped into the media booth an hour ago. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Marcus. He was standing there, chest expanded, chin tilted up, basking in the anticipation of his own greatness. He looked like a king about to be crowned. He had no idea that the document about to flash across the screen wasn't a promotional video, but a scanned copy of the forged deed and the offshore wire transfers that proved he had sold his mother's home to a shell company he controlled. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and expectant. The hum of the projector grew louder. "Wait for it," Elena whispered to herself, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears. Marcus frowned, glancing toward the tech booth when the video didn't start immediately. He tapped the microphone again. "Technical difficulties," he joked, though his voice had a slight edge of irritation. "Give us a second. Perfection takes time." He turned back to the audience, his smile widening as the screens finally flickered to life. The first image wasn't the Vance crest. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank statement, the red ink of a final notice stamp glowing like a fresh wound against the white background. Elena took a slow, deep breath of the lily-scented air. The hunt was over. The trap had just snapped shut. The flickering light from the projector cast a ghostly blue hue over the ballroom, turning the gathered elite into a gallery of frozen statues. Marcus stood paralyzed as the beam cut through the dimness, illuminating the ruin of his reputation in high definition. His eyes, usually narrowed with calculated arrogance, bulged as he stared at the final notices, the whites of his eyes gleaming like polished marble against the dark background of the screen. The healthy, bourbon-induced flush that had colored his face only moments ago vanished, replaced by a ghastly, translucent gray that made the sweat on his forehead shimmer under the lights. His mouth worked soundlessly, his lips twitching into a grotesque, lopsided sneer that couldn't quite form a word. He looked like a man watching his own execution, his chest heaving in short, panicked bursts that rattled in the sudden silence of the room. The smell of scorched dust from the projector's cooling fan drifted through the air, mingling with the now-cloying scent of the lilies. Beatrice Vance was the first to break the stillness. Her hand flew to the string of pearls at her throat, her knuckles white as she leaned forward to squint at the numbers. "Marcus!" Her voice was a brittle whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. "What is the meaning of this? Why is the estate listed as collateral for a gambling syndicate?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He reached out to steady himself, but his hand caught the edge of a silver champagne bucket. It tipped, the ice clattering across the floor like a hail of diamonds, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet. Julian Thorne stepped out from the shadows near the bar, his legal mind already dissecting the documents on the screen. He adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of professional disgust. "Those aren't just notices, Beatrice. Those are liens, registered and verified." Sarah Miller, standing beside him, gasped as the next slide clicked into place. It was a recorded wire transfer, $6 million, moved from the Vance Foundation to an offshore account in Macau. "He didn't just lose the house," she whispered, her voice trembling with the thrill of the scandal. "He stole the charity funds to cover the markers." Arthur Vance sat in his wheelchair at the front of the room, his gnarled hands gripping the armrests. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his son. For the first time in decades, the old man's eyes weren't clouded with illness. They were sharp with the cold, hard clarity of a patriarch who had finally seen the rot in his own bloodline. Elena walked slowly toward the podium, the rhythmic clack of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She stopped just a few feet from Marcus, who was now leaning heavily against the wood, his breathing audible through the microphone he'd forgotten to turn off. "You spent the last year telling everyone I was a charity case," she said, her voice calm and steady as ice. "You told the board I was an interloper who didn't understand the weight of the Vance name. You even tried to have me escorted out tonight because I didn't belong in a room of this caliber." Marcus finally found his voice, though it was a ragged, desperate thing. "This is a fabrication, a hack. Elena, you've gone too far. I'll have you arrested for." "For what? Showing the board the truth?" She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key and a folded parchment. She didn't hand them to him. She laid them on the podium, right over his trembling hands. "The syndicate didn't just sell the debt, Marcus. They were looking for a quick exit. They wanted someone who could pay the principal in full tonight." The room went so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. "I didn't just find the evidence," she continued, leaning in so only he could smell the faint, sharp scent of her perfume, the same one his mother used to wear. "I bought the notes, the house, the land, the foundation, and the chair you're currently leaning on. I own it all." Marcus looked down at the key as if it were a coiled viper. You don't have that kind of money." "I have the Vance family's integrity," she replied, her eyes never wavering from his. "Something you traded away for a seat at a high-stakes table in Macau. You wanted to show the world the Vance legacy tonight. Well, look at the screen. This is your legacy." She turned to the audience, her gaze lingering on Beatrice and then Arthur. Silas, standing by the heavy oak doors, gave her a single, slow nod of respect. "The gala is over," Elena announced, her voice echoing with an authority that Marcus had never possessed. "The lawyers will be in touch with the board tomorrow morning. As for you, Marcus," she paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over him like a shroud. "You have until midnight to pack a bag. Security will meet you at the gate." She didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch him crumble or listen to the frantic murmurs of the crowd as they began to swarm the podium. She turned her back on the ruin and walked toward the exit, her head held high. Behind her, the projector flickered one last time, displaying a final document, a signed eviction notice, dated for that very evening. Elena stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy doors groaning shut behind her, leaving the chaos of the Vance families fall inside the dark. She took a deep breath of the damp earth and night-blooming jasmine, her fingers brushing the phone in her pocket. It was time for the final call. The silence inside the ballroom was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. Marcus Vance stood frozen on the stage, the blue light of the projector casting a ghostly pallor over his features. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, but was still waiting for the thunder to reach him. His eyes, usually sharp with a predator's arrogance, were wide and glassy, darting frantically from the screen to the faces of the people who, only minutes ago, had been his subjects. Marcus Vance's face underwent a violent transformation. The arrogance that usually defined his brow collapsed, replaced by a frantic, twitching desperation. His skin, once bronzed and smooth, turned a translucent, sickly white, making the veins in his temples throb like trapped insects. His eyes bulged, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as he stared at the eviction notice on the screen, his gaze darting back and forth as if trying to find a typo that didn't exist. His jaw hung slack, his mouth working silently like a fish gasping for air, while a thin sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his perfectly styled hair into oily clumps. It wasn't just shock. It was the total disintegration of a man who realized his shadow was longer than his substance. He tried to swallow, but his throat had constricted into a dry, tight knot. Beatrice Vance moved first. She didn't go to him. Instead, she stepped back, her silk gown rustling like a warning. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers clutching the pearls that had been in the family for 3 generations, the same pearls her son had nearly gambled away. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice carrying through the hushed room. He tried to find his voice, but it came out as a ragged croak. "It's a fabrication. She's unstable. These are forgeries, Mother. She's trying to ruin us." "They aren't forgeries, Marcus." Julian Thorne stepped forward from the edge of the dais. As the family's primary legal counsel, his word carried the weight of a gavel. He held a tablet in his hand, his eyes scanning the digital counterparts of the documents Elena had just displayed. "I've just received the verified filings from the state registrar. The transfer of the deed was executed 6 months ago. The signatures are notarized. The Vance estate, this house, the grounds, the holdings, it all belongs to Elena Vance, every square inch." A murmur rippled through the board members like a physical wave. Sarah Miller, who had spent the evening laughing at his jokes and sipping his champagne, suddenly looked at him as if he were a contagion. She physically shifted her chair away, the screech of wood on marble sounding like a final judgment. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were cold, already calculating how to distance her own brand from the impending wreckage. "Security!" Julian called out, his voice devoid of emotion. "Wait!" He shouted, his hands clawing at the air as if he could grab the crumbling pieces of his life. "You can't do this. I am a Vance. This is my birthright. I grew up in these halls." "You forfeited your birthright at the poker tables in Macau," Silas said, appearing from the shadows of the wings. The old man looked taller now, his back straight, no longer bowed by the weight of his employer's demands. He held a heavy ring of keys, the master set Marcus had demanded he hand over weeks ago. "The lady of the house has given her instructions. You have until midnight. Security will escort you to your room to collect your personal effects. Only personal effects. Anything belonging to the estate stays." The 2 guards Elena had hired stepped onto the stage. They didn't touch him, not yet, but their presence was an ultimatum. They stood like pillars of stone, their eyes fixed on a point just past his head. He looked at his mother, a desperate, feral hope in his eyes. "Mother, tell them she can't do this. I'm your son." Beatrice looked at him. For the first time, she truly saw the hollowed-out shell of the man she had enabled. She saw the lies, the theft, and the utter disregard for the legacy she held dear. She didn't speak. She simply turned her back on him and walked toward the far end of the hall where Arthur Vance sat in his wheelchair. The old man hadn't moved, but his eyes were bright with a terrifying, silent clarity. "Midnight," Silas repeated, the word sounding like a closing door. The walk through the ballroom was a gauntlet of rejection. As the guards led him toward the rear exit, the crowd parted as if he were a leper. The smell of the expensive lilies in the foyer now felt cloying, like funeral flowers. He caught his reflection in the grand gilt mirror. The one he'd bragged was worth more than a suburban home. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a thief caught with his hands in the till. Outside, the rain had started to fall, a fine, cold mist that dampened his custom-tailored suit. The smell of wet stone and ozone filled the air. He stood on the gravel driveway, his shoes crunching on the expensive stone, watching the taillights of a sleek black sedan disappear down the long, oak-lined drive. Elena was gone. She had delivered the blow and hadn't even stayed to watch the blood hit the floor. That was the ultimate insult. He wasn't even worth her audience. He reached into his pocket, his fingers trembling as he felt for his phone, desperate to call anyone who would listen. But as he pulled it out, the screen flickered and died. The service had been disconnected. He stood alone in the dark, the rain soaking through his silk shirt while the lights of the house that no longer belonged to him, shone brightly behind him. He was a Vance in name only, and even that felt like a borrowed coat he was being forced to return. He looked toward the gate, where the security team stood waiting, their silhouettes sharp against the night. He had 2 hours to pack a life he had never truly earned. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the estate had clicked shut behind Marcus, a sound that had punctuated the end of an era with the finality of a gavel. The transition had been quiet, lacking the explosive drama of the revelation, but the silence that followed was far more profound. Elena Vance sat in the library, the morning sun casting long, golden rectangles across the polished mahogany of the desk. The room no longer smelled of stale scotch and the heavy, oppressive scent of Marcus's expensive cigars. Instead, it smelled of lemon oil, old parchment, and the faint, sweet drift of lavender from the garden Silas had spent the last 20 weeks meticulously restoring. She ran her fingers over the leather-bound ledger in front of her. It was a clean book, every entry verified, every cent accounted for. The sleeping lion had not just woken up, she had taken over the pride. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah Miller. The lawyer looked different than she had during the frantic weeks of the audit. Her shoulders were relaxed, and the sharp edge of her professional mask had softened into something resembling genuine friendship. She placed a small, manila envelope on the desk. "The final liquidation of his personal assets is complete," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "After the restitution for the embezzled funds and the legal fees, there was very little left. He's moved into a studio apartment in the city. It's above a 24-hour laundromat." Elena didn't feel the rush of triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a cold, hollow sort of peace. "Does he have a job?" "A junior clerk position at an insurance firm," Sarah replied, taking a seat. "Entry level. I heard he tried to use the Vance name to get a corner office on his first day. They laughed him out of the room. He's just another face in the cubicle farm now, Elena. No one remembers the wounded wolf except as a cautionary tale in the financial journals." The image of Marcus, who had once sneered at anyone who wore a suit off the rack, sitting under flickering fluorescent lights and filing paperwork for people he used to consider beneath him, was a sharp, jagged piece of karma. He had always defined himself by his height above others. Now he was buried in the mundane. "And my father?" Elena asked. "Arthur is waiting for you on the terrace," Sarah said. "He's having tea with Beatrice." Elena stood, the heavy brass key to the estate's private archives weighted in her pocket. As she walked through the halls, she passed the portrait of the Vance family. Marcus's face had not been removed, but the light seemed to hit it differently now, Or perhaps it was just that Elena no longer saw a threat when she looked at him. She saw a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a table that didn't belong to him. On the terrace, the air was crisp. Arthur Vance sat in a wheelchair, a thick wool blanket over his knees. He looked frailer than he had 6 months ago, the stress of the betrayal having carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes were clear. He was observant again, no longer shielded by the lies Marcus had spun. Beatrice Vance stood by his side, pouring tea with a hand that still trembled occasionally. She had been the hardest to reconcile with. The woman who had once obsessed over the purity of the family legacy had been forced to face the fact that she had nurtured the very rot that nearly destroyed it. "The gardens look beautiful, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice quiet. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the porcelain cup. There was a distance between them that 1,000 shared teas would never bridge. The cost of the truth had been the comfortable illusion of their family bond. They were survivors now, bound by blood and a shared trauma, but the warmth was gone. "Silas says the oaks will need pruning before winter," Elena remarked, stepping to the stone balustrade. She looked out over the oak-lined drive where she had last seen the taillights of Marcus's car. She had saved the house. She had saved the name. She had even saved the employees like Silas who had remained loyal when the ship was sinking. But as she looked at her father's thinning hair and her mother's hollowed eyes, she realized that justice was a surgical procedure. It removed the cancer, but it always left a scar. She reached into her pocket and gripped the key. She was the head of the House of Vance, a position she had never wanted but had earned in the trenches of her brother's greed. She was thriving, the business was stable, and the heritage was secure. But as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming winter, Elena realized the true weight of her victory. She had won everything Marcus had tried to steal, only to discover that the most valuable thing in the house, the simple, unburdened love of a brother, was the one thing that could never be restored. She turned back to the tea service, a queen in a silent castle, watching the sun set over a kingdom that was finally, peacefully, alone.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.